Live. Hey guys, this is Annie with Celltown Realty. I tonight am interviewing Adam Hiscock, who is a geologist in town, and I really hope that people weigh in on this one because this is a really important topic in an area with a lot of fault lines. So hey,
Hey,
how are
it worked.
you?
I'm good.
It worked. I know. It's always like such a relief when somebody, is able to log on quickly. You're like, okay, let's do this thing.
Yeah, totally.
So
Yeah.
this is Adam Hiscock. He is a project geologist with the Utah Geological Survey. And we have never met before. So this is our first time
Yeah.
live on Instagram meeting.
Yeah.
So it's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Why don't you give me your bio, like what it is that you do, how long you've been doing it? Give me the little intro there.
Yeah. I've worked at the Utah Geologic Survey now for 12 years. It's hard to believe it's been that long.
I know.
I started right out of college. So I went to the University of Utah. I have my bachelor's degree in geology from the U. And yeah, and I when I started at UGS, Utah Geologic Survey, I basically was I collected a lot of field data and did field work, and then I kind of moved into a role where I primarily do earthquake research and earthquake and fault research. I'm part of our geologic hazards group, which our role is to study geologic hazards across the state. So anything from like earthquakes, like I do. We have a bunch of people that do landslide work, so they map landslides and monitor landslides. Yeah, they've been extremely busy lately and been on the news a lot with interviews and such. We do flood mapping. So we basically any kind of natural disaster that's geologic related, we study, and everything that we, all the maps we produce and data we make is all publicly available and available on our website for basically for land use, for homeowners, for the public in Utah. So
I love that. Yeah. So the person who introduced us, I remember when he was shopping for his house, gave me a few maps that had fault lines, and I felt like I had this gold in my hand. I was like, oh my gosh. And then I looked at my houses and went, oh, one of them is basically right on top of that fault line.
Yeah, a lot of people say that.
Are you from another earthquake state? Like what got you into geology and specifically into earthquake or hazard studies within geology?
Well, so I'm from Utah. I'm from southern Utah originally, but I was raised by a park ranger. My dad was a career park ranger, so I spent a lot of time outdoors as a kid, and I would say that probably was a pretty big influence on me getting into geology. And for a while, I lived in Alaska as a child for a while too, and I had one experience there that like I was little, but it really made me realize I wanted to be a geologist. I think that's what I like to say, at least. There was a volcanic eruption. I lived in Anchorage in the early 90s, and it didn't cause any damage to where I lived or anything, or really anywhere because it was so remote. But it was a nice summer day, and I went outside. I was playing Nintendo at a friend's house, and my mom came to get me, and we went outside, and the ash cloud had moved over Anchorage, and like it was dark. So I just remember being like in wow of that, like whoa, like this is crazy. I want to know more about this someday.
Oh, that's such a cool Genesis story. I love that.
Yeah.
Have you? Sorry, I should have warned you that I send you a list of questions that I generally do, but then I just will spring things on you also.
That's fine.
Have you been in a big earthquake before?
So when like I mentioned, I was born in Utah, but I lived in Alaska as a child, and I remember a couple earthquakes when I lived there, which, Alaska is probably one of the most earthquake prone states in the country.
Yeah.
But I don't remember them very well, because I was a kid, but honestly, I think the first like big earthquake that I remember being in my life was just a few years ago, was the Magna 2020 earthquake that I'm sure you remember, and anybody who's lived here for longer than 3 years would remember that.
Yeah. No, that was really significant for, I'm sure, people here on this live feed. That was really significant. And I think a lot of people, it was their first earthquake ever.
Yeah.
I grew up in California and remember the '89 earthquake that collapsed the Bay Bridge, and remember it very viscerally. And I did not want to become a geologist. Like, I don't think I want to know about it. So
I know. Earthquakes are scary.
yeah. So tell us about the fault lines here in Utah. Like, I'm shocked constantly that people don't know this is an earthquake state. So I'd love to know, how does it rank against California and Alaska? How many fault lines do we have? That kind of thing.
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. Like people don't realize that we live in earthquake country here. But outside of the West Coast, so like California, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska, and Canada, Utah is probably the most seismically active state in the country outside of those West Coast states. We have a lot of different fault lines here. I mean, the main one that kind of gets all the attention and that we all think about because most of our population lives right next to it is the Wasatch Fault, which runs all the way from like up near Malad City, Idaho to almost central Utah, like Fayette, Utah.
Okay.
It's about 220 miles-ish long, and it's divided into different sections. So there's like 10 different major sections of the Wasatch Fault. Here in the Salt Lake Valley, this is called the Salt Lake City segment of the Wasatch Fault Zone. There's a segment by Provo called the Provo segment. There's the Nephi segment. Up north, there's the Weber segment and the Brigham City segment. And even though it's all one continuous fault line, these segments we would say they rupture independently, so they have earthquakes separately of one another.
Oh, interesting.
And one thing that we study is how often those earthquakes happen, and if there's any chance that that sometimes they rupture together, or there's like there's an earthquake that influences two parts of the fault. So that's the Wasatch Fault. It gets the most press, I guess you could say. But there's, even down in southern Utah, there's 2 or 3 major faults that run right through St. George. There's the East and West Cache fault zones up by Logan. Pretty much most of western Utah, and wherever you live, if you live way out in the middle of the West Desert, you're near a fault.
Yeah.
That's just the nature of the geology of that part of the state.
Yeah, no doubt. I live in kind of a new row of townhouses, and on, kind of across from me, there's a bunch of luxury apartments. And then there's this big swath of land in the middle where they're currently building a park. And people are always like, oh, that's nice that they're building a park there. And it is nice. Like, all of these apartments and townhouses are going to benefit from it. But the reason that they're building a park there is because there's a fault line there, like specifically right there. And they're just not allowed to build there, which I was shocked to learn. Because I feel like, being from California, everything is built and thought of and designed and constructed in regards to like seismic activity. Like, you can't renovate a house without like doing seismic renovations, but here they just don't have that in the building codes. So I'm like, well, at least they don't build right on fault lines. At least we have that going for us.
Yeah, we're getting there. Like, that's a good point, because California is ahead of us with those sort of things, with building near faults and such. But a lot of the work we do is specifically, like, we map fault lines, and we make these zones around them that are called special study zones, and then we give those to cities and counties, and they use those for like ordinances. So like, if you wanted to like, Draper has an ordinance, I believe Salt Lake County has a fault ordinance. So if you want to develop where you want to develop lands in that zone, you're required to do a study. And if they find a fault when they're doing that study, specifically right there, then you can't develop, and you have to build a park, like you said, basically. So
well, that's good to know that there's some level of thoughtfulness, because I often help people from maybe California or these other states buy houses here, and they always ask, like, has this been upgraded for seismic considerations? And I'm like, no, it hasn't. Pretty rare for that to happen. Do you guys work with any sort of like building code enforcement in that regard? Like, and this might be out of your wheelhouse, and that's fine if it is. It just makes me curious about it.
No, we don't. A lot of the data we give to cities and building officials and the legislature and such they're supposed to use that to help adopt, to like change the building codes. I don't know a ton about building codes. It's out of my wheelhouse, but
And that's
but we're hoping, like, you know, that, like I said, like Utah's changing for the better, I think, in that regard. Like we know where more of the faults are now. So hopefully, you know, we'll get better building codes, and and more homes and buildings and such will be like upgraded for seismic safety. I mean, I'm sitting in my house right now. I live in Sugar House, and I live like a block from the East Bench Fault, which is part of the Wasatch Fault.
Yeah.
So we're basically right on top of a fault too.
Yeah.
A lot of us do.
Yeah, for sure. I think people would be shocked to see the fault line map where their houses line up in them. So I think that a question that like everybody always wants to ask about fault lines is like, when is the big one? And I've heard this idea that the Wasatch fault line hasn't gone big in like 2,000 years or 3,000 years, and it's supposed to go big every 1,000 years or something. I'm forgetting the exact numbers that people talk about. Do you want to speak to that? Is there such a thing? And like, what is it?
Well, so like I mentioned, there's different segments of the Wasatch Fault, and they all rupture a little bit differently. So for example, like the Nephi segment of the Wasatch Fault, all the way south of here by Nephi, Utah, the last large earthquake on the Nephi segment, when I say large earthquake, I mean an earthquake large enough to actually rupture the surface along the fault line.
Okay. What is that in terms of the numbers?
It would be a magnitude, here in Utah, it'd be a magnitude 6.5 or greater. It basically has to be a 6.5 to do that.
Remind me what the Magna one was in 2020?
Magna was 5.7.
Okay. Just for scale.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So on the Nephi segment, there was a large earthquake like that 200 years ago. Okay. So pretty recent. I mean, for us geologists, it's like, you know, 1,000 years is a blink of an eye. Yeah. But the average recurrence interval on different segments of the Wasatch Fault does kind of vary. Recurrence interval meaning like how long of time between two big earthquakes. Right. And some segments are overdue for large earthquakes, and some aren't. Like the Nephi segment wouldn't be. Mm-hmm. But it's also not an exact sort of thing. You know, like you look at, like when we do these studies where we look at past earthquakes on faults, sometimes we find that, you know, there were a few earthquakes within a couple hundred years of each other, big ones, and then there was nothing for like 2,000 years. So it's not always, they don't follow an exact time frame. Yeah. But there are like, when we have like some probability numbers and stuff that we share. It's like, I have one of them written down right here. You know, there's a 57% probability that the Wasatch Front region as a whole will experience a magnitude 6.0 or greater in the next 50 years. Okay. So 50%, yeah.
57% is so vague. It's like, so there's a 50-50 chance that we might have something huge.
It's kind of, yeah. Earthquake science is hard. It's hard to, I mean, there's no way to predict earthquakes, basically. Yeah. That's not, we can do the best we can with studying when past ones occurred to try to figure out when the next one's going to happen, or somewhat, you know, rough idea. And the Magna earthquake was like a eye-opener for us, and it was smaller, but it was still really important and made us kind of rethink a lot of hazards and earthquake hazards, especially in Salt Lake. So
I feel like I heard that you guys knew that was coming. Is that true at all?
No.
Like that there were little rumblings or something you knew? I don't know.
No, there wasn't any. No, we didn't know it was coming. I mean, there have been like we call that like a moderate magnitude, a moderate earthquake. And I've talked to a lot of people who are like, oh, how was that moderate? That was terrifying. It was scary. I mean, I was scared. We all were, but it wasn't as big as we could have an earthquake here. And there's been other ones like that. I think in 1964, if I'm right, there was a similar sized earthquake that was near Magna, kind of same thing. So it's not, that one wasn't completely out of the blue, but we did not know it was going to happen.
I'm having this like kind of dumb realization right now that I think there was a part of me that was like, well, at least some pressure was relieved from the fault, but that like the Magna fault is totally different than the Wasatch fault. So it's like, it's not even part of the same thing. I was like, oh, it's okay. There's been some pressure relieved. We'll be fine.
Actually, I will say, so we now think that the Magna earthquake was on the Wasatch fault. And the way that works is the Wasatch Fault over on the east side of the valley, like we're in Sugar House, it goes at an angle under the Salt Lake Valley to the west. So we think that earthquake was on the Wasatch Fault about 7 miles beneath the bottom of the valley. And so, I mean, we don't know, there's no way to know for sure if it relieved any strain on the Wasatch Fault, but it was essentially an earthquake on the Wasatch Fault that, it was relieving strain. That's why an earthquake happened. It was relieving pressure on the fault. So that doesn't mean that we're out of the, that doesn't mean we're not like ever going to have a big earthquake again or anything. So
I'm sure that there's plenty of fault lines like in Japan that have a magnitude 5.7 and then the next day have a whatever they get over there, they get humongous ones.
They get huge earthquakes in Japan.
Yeah.
Very huge.
Yeah. I feel like they're a bit more used to it though because they're more frequent. I think that's the thing about living in Salt Lake is, I mean, I've lived here for 11 years and that's the only one I felt here. Mm-hmm. So it's so easy to just forget that it's a thing.
Totally.
It's like, I wish we could get like some small ones more frequently so we could like keep it in our brains that it's a thing.
That was a nice thing about the Magna earthquake in a way, is it just reminded everybody to be prepared.
Yeah.
For one. So.
No, it's very true.
Yeah.
I got this really great pamphlet online through, I don't know where I got it, but I blew it up really big. It's like, and it was basically like how to prepare your house for an earthquake, and talked about things like so many places. Like I went to a house the other day that they had all these milk crates stacked up like all the way up to the ceiling, and they were all filled with books. It was very like cool and kitschy looking. But, I went and did like a little wiggle and they're not attached. And I'm just like, people just don't think about earthquakes in this town. Like those things could, smush a toddler or something if they fell over. I created these pamphlets to like hand out to clients, like how can you earthquake proof your house? And I had a hutch that wasn't attached, did the same thing, went in and like drilled it to the wall. Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you can share with people that are considerations that people should have? Like if you're living in an earthquake state, you should blank. Do you have any kind of recommendations in that way?
Yeah, I mean, like you just said, like just securing stuff. I mean, I don't have the stat in front of me. I don't remember, but I saw a stat once that said something about earthquakes in California and how just like the majority of the injuries occur just from stuff falling off of shelves and breaking, like dishes and glass, sharp things, and then people walk on them when they're trying to get out of their house, to get under a table or in a door frame. So yeah, I mean, I'm guilty of not having stuff secured the way it should be, and after that Magna earthquake I've gotten a lot better about that.
One that I read was not hanging anything very heavy over your bed. A lot of people have like a big mirror over the top of their bed or a huge piece of art or whatever like that. And if that fell off in the night, if it happened in the night, that could be really
hurt.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny because that's my wife and I had a huge framed picture above our bed. And then after the Magna earthquake, we moved it and redecorated because I didn't want that to fall on our faces.
Yeah. 100%. It was a good reminder.
Yeah. So other than that, I mean, there's a lot of, besides like doing little things around your house like that, just being like prepared and having some kind of a small emergency kit is really important after an earthquake. And even like if you're into camping and getting outside, like I am, like a lot of people have, camping water jugs that you take camping with you in the desert. Like I just leave those filled up now when I get back home off of a trip in my garage, like those water jugs, just in case, because I figure if something happens to my house and our water's out after a big earthquake, I can get them in my garage and at least have some water if water lines are knocked out. So yeah.
We had our power was out for I think 2 full days on the west side, and that was a little bit different than some of the other areas around town. But at that time I went, I don't really have much in the way of flashlights or candles or like any of these things. So, I mean, 2020 was such a rugged year with COVID and the earthquake and the hurricane that like we really got hit by a lot of things. So I think there's a lot of emergency preparedness, but I think it's important to know that like, even though we're not in that crisis state, remember that you got to have those things around the house.
Yeah.
Do that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, my power was out for a week after that
Oh,
the
wow.
hurricane thing, the windstorm. That was crazy.
That was way crazy. Yeah, that's a whole other topic. I don't know
Yeah,
what field somebody would need to study to figure that one out.
yeah.
So,
I don't know.
yeah, what a year.
Yeah.
Do you live in a brick house, just out of curiosity?
I do not actually. I live in an old house because it's a sugar house. It's built in 1947,
Yeah.
but it is wood frame.
Okay.
Um,
Was that intentional?
Not really. No. When we bought our house in 2015, and when we were house shopping, we looked at a lot of brick houses in Sugar House. Um, but now that I'm glad we live in a stick frame house, but there's ways to improve brick houses too. You can retrofit a brick house. It's if you're ever doing any remodeling, there's a lot of small things you can do to a brick house, like just when you have drywall down, so you can kind of do it piecemeal, like little bits and pieces at a time to make it safer. So
Yeah. Yeah, I'll have to have an engineer on to talk
yeah.
about retrofitting brick houses. But one that I learned that, well, we should wrap up here in a second, but one that I learned through another client is he has a 2-story brick house that is like, you look at it and you're like, oh man, that's a 2-story brick house. But he had guys put on a new roof, and what they do is like drill down into the sides of the thing. And apparently, and maybe you can confirm this or disconfirm this, but apparently in earthquakes, a lot of times what happens is the roof kind of hops off. Like the roof isn't necessarily really tied into the structure very well on a brick house. And so you'll get roofs that kind of just like off the side. So they do this where they drill way down into the bricks so that the roof is actually physically attached to the house so it can handle the shimmy.
Yeah, that's exactly true. I've heard of that same thing. Yeah, and even like stick houses like mine, it's kind of different, but like the walls sometimes aren't tied into the foundation. Like in like my foundation is I think cement block with cement over it. So like another thing you can do is tie your walls into your foundation, whether you're in a stick house or a brick house. Because sometimes not just the roof will hop around, but the whole house can kind of wiggle off of the foundation actually.
Yeah. Yeah, the amounts of times everybody who's shopped for a house or owns a house in, Liberty Wells, where there's like in the basement, the uprights holding it up, and there's actually nothing attaching it. It's just sitting on top of those. And so basically every single inspection report is like strapping, metal strapping, attach it to itself. So just make sure your house is all attached to itself. That's probably the best bet.
Another easy thing too that like people can do too that you can do on your own, which I did on my own, is just anchoring your hot water heater. That's probably something you know about as a realtor, and it comes up in inspections. There's a lot of houses where they don't have hot water heaters anchored into the wall, and then if it tips over in an earthquake, you can have a gas leak. That's kind of the scary thing with an unanchored hot water heater. So yeah,
just an easy earthquake strap on there, and that comes up in so many reports for sure.
Yeah.
Well, this has been enlightening. Unfortunately, I don't have any questions from the live. Every once in a while, somebody will type it in later because it'll go and stay on my feed so people can watch it afterwards. I'll let you know if there's any questions that pop up. But I so appreciate you coming on here. It's been like my dream. I've been doing this thing for maybe 2 years or something, and I've always wanted to have a geologist. So I'm psyched to have been introduced to you. Thanks for Ryan for that intro. And thanks for joining me.
It was nice chatting with you. And I might, if you do want to have an engineer on sometime, I might have a recommendation for you.
That could be really cool.
We should message. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Yeah, you too. Thanks, Annie.
Yeah.
Bye.